All right, welcome everybody to today's session, navigating limited recourse borrowing arrangements in the SMSF. So obviously I'll put a specific date there, 10th of August 2026, because we have some pretty significant change, well, one significant change for limited recourse borrowing arrangement. And so obviously we want to work through that today. Now, the legislation has passed, so this is everything as it stands. I think that, it's fair to say that there's still a little bit that we're waiting on to work itself through with regard, or not waiting on so much. So the law is in place, but there's a hope, I guess, from an industry point of view, that we get some, I guess, further debate on this subject as far as self-managed super funds and LRBAs with regards to new residential builds. So as of everything I talk about today, it's legislated as it is, but there is still some potential hope or desire for some changes to the legislation as we go along. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what those changes are, how the new law impacts things from an SMSF point of view. I guess what it means from a reflective point of view with reference to business real property, because that in itself has some things to consider with regards to the new definition. Just touch on the safe harbour changes. So what we will see from this new financial year from an interest point of view, and then just to finish off, really just dive into a little bit around the alternate investment strategies when people are contemplating residential property for self-managed superannuation funds. So, a bit to go through. Really, they're just a bit of a time frame for us to be able to, see I guess, what's happened with regards to limited recourse borrowing arrangements, and what they mean, and what they've meant to the industry over the past nearly 20 years. Okay, so 2027 will be the 20-year anniversary of when instalment warrants first came about and first introduced for self-managed superannuation funds. We clearly saw some significant change in the way that the legislation worked from 2010. So law comes in 2007, fair bit of change in 2010, clarification, a lot of key stuff from 2012, and then a lot of things around the tax and the whole non-arm's length nature of transaction in that 2015-2016 period. And then ultimately nothing for the last 10 years, and then from that point in time, every time there's a budget, every time there's a government review into superannuation, the question always arises as to whether or not the limited recourse borrowing arrangements will be banned. Of course, we thought that when the federal budget was announced this year, that we'd got through that with the changes around CGT, the changes related to discretionary trusts, and all of a sudden super became this very popular investment vehicle. And when I say just became, it's obviously always been a popular investment vehicle, but the idea of acquiring property through a superannuation fund really skyrocketed after federal budget. Now, clearly the government knew what they were about to do. Or maybe it had conversations in the background, who knows? But we then got to the point where to pass the budget measures, the Greens spoke up and they said, we want to change the limited recourse borrowing arrangement. And that's where we got to with this session and the changes that were introduced. So the standard rules for LRBAs is that they apply to a single acquirable asset, and that's the only thing that's changed from the 10th of August 2026, right? The definition of what is a single acquirable asset, or what is an acquirable asset, what is an acceptable acquirable asset from the 10th of August. That's the only change that we've got. Everything else remains the same. So the asset, we cannot use borrowed monies to improve it. We can use borrowed monies to repair or maintain, unless the level of the nature of that repair and maintenance is such that it actually leads to an improvement. And a lot of that can be found in our SMSF ruling from 2012. But again, no borrowed monies there. We can use fund money to improve the investment. And again, that doesn't change. So from the 10th of August, we don't have any changes there. However, there's the caveat around business real property. And of course, I'll spend a bit of time today focusing and touching on that whole business real property piece and what it means from a superannuation fund point of view. The loan piece there, where the loan is from the lender, whether it be a related party, whether it be a commercial lender, to the trustees of the fund. That the only difference there, and I'm not going to focus on it today, is those intermediary limited recourse borrowing arrangements where the loan is actually to the holding trustee, so that the name of the loan, the name of the investment, etc., are all in the same name. I think I did a webinar last year at some point in time on the limited recourse borrowing arrangements for SuperGuardian, and I spent a bit of time talking about intermediary LRBAs. So you can go back and have a look on their education page, on the SuperGuardian education page, at their past webinars, because there's some content there in regards to the intermediary LRBAs. So yeah, so all of the other concepts of limited recourse borrowing arrangements as we know them, they remain the same moving forward. The safe harbour, as I said, this is an area that we've watched with real interest over the last few years, because when the safe harbour stuff was introduced, let's say from 2018, around that time, 17, 18 time onwards, we've seen sort of these really effectively not quite double, but they started around that 5.5% with regards to property, and then obviously add a couple more percent for your share style borrowings from a related party loan piece. But what we've seen now is the May interest rate, which was, at I think whatever the number was, 7.35. So therefore we add the 2%. So 9.35 is the rate that we. Sorry, when I say we add the 2%, we add the 2% for the shares. So 9.35 is the new rate. So this is taking us back to where the LRBA rates were 2 or 3 years ago, and sort of from a heightened point of view, you've got to really look at that and say, well, is there value still in that, in doing related party loans, and paying that additional amount of interest from a safe harbour? Clearly, there's value if your objective is to avoid non-arm's length income for the fund, but it is a high rate to pay. Of course, particularly when you're measuring it against some of the commercial opportunities out there, which are generally in that sort of high 6 to 7% from a commercial lender for limited recourse borrowing arrangements. So, as I said, all that sort of stuff, the standard rules around limited recourse borrowing arrangements have not changed under the legislative things that occurred through June following the federal budget. But there's been one specific inclusion, which you've obviously all heard about, around the whole residential property piece, and that's really the focus on what we want to talk about. So what happened? Government made their announcements as part of federal budget, where we're changing capital gains tax rules. We are removing negative gearing, except for so there's grandfathering rules, obviously, and I'm not going to focus too heavily on what all the budget announcements were, but removal of negative gearing for property investments or certain property investments, but some introduction of some things around new residential properties, right? And so it kind of reduced the ability for people to go out there, find property, buy property, and get some tax breaks associated with it. Of course, as part of those announcements, there was no changes in the superannuation environment. So it led, particularly through that May period, to significant discussion around how self-managed super funds all of a sudden were very attractive from an investment point of view when it came to residential property, appreciating the restrictions, so the inability to lease property to a related party. So taking all that into consideration, there was a lot of conversation around how valuable self-managed super funds would be with regards to investments. Clearly, the Greens, who have been in opposition, to limited recourse borrowing arrangements for a significant period of time, they use this as an opportunity to say, right, well, we will support your budget measures, say the CGT changes. Clearly, there's other things around the discretionary trust distributions to come as well, but we will support that because obviously Labor don't have the numbers in the Senate. We will support it subject to you disallowing limited recourse borrowing arrangements over residential property in a self-managed superannuation fund. So conceptually, that's what their objective was, to say that we are going to, or we want to have a ban imposed on acquiring residential property through self-managed superannuation funds. The government agreed, and ultimately what they introduced was changes to the SIS Act, specifically Section 67A, to say that under the concept of that you can only acquire a single acquirable asset, to say for an asset that is real property, the asset must be business real property as defined in Section 66, right? So Section 66 is our acquisition of an asset from a related party requirements, and that obviously has the incorporation of business real property as an asset that we can acquire from a related party, and then goes through what the definition of business real property is. So what we've seen is Section 67A following on from Section 66 and referencing back to it to say if the asset that is subject to the limited recourse borrowing arrangement is real property, it must satisfy the definition of real property. That's what came in, and it came in effect from 45 days following royal assent. Okay, so the 10th of August is effectively our date. So these measures are live now, and now we're in a position where only certain transactions entered into up to or leading up to the 10th of August will satisfy the requirements. All existing arrangements, all existing limited recourse borrowing arrangements are grandfathered. So any residential properties that required prior to that time have been grandfathered. So there's no issue, no consideration there that we have to take into to our thought processes from fund administration, fund compliance, fund advice points of view. So let's work through some of the key issues of what this announcement means with regards to LRBAs moving forward. LRBAs entered into from or prior to the 10th of August, and what that means from a compliance point of view. So the first thing or the main thing is that all existing arrangements, nothing to see here, they will continue on. Similar to what I highlighted before is that we've still got all our concepts around improvements and all sorts of other things. So if we change the nature of any pre-10 August 2026 investment, if we change the nature of it through making improvements, then we're in breach of the section. Now, similarly, and I'll reiterate this point a little bit later, if we now enter into an arrangement to acquire business real property by a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, that's fine. But if whilst that LRBA is live, if we change the nature or the asset is no longer subject to the business real property exemption or exception, then we will fail under the borrowing provisions as well. So we've got to make sure that any arrangement that we enter into from now onwards not only satisfies the definition of business real property at acquisition, but it also then satisfies the definition of business real property on an ongoing basis until such time as the LRBA is paid out. And then clearly, once the asset is transferred from the holding trustee to the self-managed super fund trustee, then what you do with that asset changes from being subject to LRBA rules to just being subject to all other rules. So again, realistically, when it comes to residential property, as you're all well aware, we just can't lease that to related parties, right? So there's nothing wrong with the self-managed super fund owning residential property. It's just the use of that property that is under scrutiny from a super fund compliance point of view, and of course acquisition rules and other things. So a couple of things that I would highlight at this point, sort of before I move into some more of the mechanics, is I think there's always a key conversation piece around prior to 10th of August anyhow, and just the concept of residential property in an SMSF, and that is that we have to be clear that we're still operating under the guise of the sole purpose test, right? And so the purpose of any investment that we make from a super fund point of view is to provide retirement benefits. It's not to provide a home to live in retirement in retirement. Okay, so if people are asking the question, and this is sort of an interpretive piece, but I think it's an interpretive piece by me, but interpretive piece supported broadly across the industry as well, is that if somebody comes to you and ask the question, can I buy residential property in my self-managed superannuation fund? And you ask the very simple question, why do you want to buy that property in your super fund? And they say, well, I want to move into it when I retire. Then the answer is no, you can't do it, right? But that's a breach of the sole purpose test. The primary purpose of that transaction is not to provide retirement benefits for the members of the fund. You might say, well, living in it is providing retirement benefit. That's not the purpose of super. So that is a problematic transaction right from the outset. If the individuals come to you and say, we'd like to buy residential property inside our self-managed super fund, we see that it has great capital appreciation. We see that it's got generous or good income yields, and so therefore it will help, one, grow the balance in the fund, two, help with the payment of pensions through the payment of rents or whatever. And so we see it as a viable investment that sits within our investment strategy, right? And they undertake a transaction like that, then that is more akin to the sole purpose test. Then a fund comes to the point where members have retired, so they might have held the property for 20 years or whatever it might be, and they say, right, we need to sell this. We're heading to retirement. We need to liquidate from a fund point of view to be able to continue to pay pensions or whatever. They go and they ask the question, or the member dies or something happens, and say, can we transfer this property now to beneficiaries or to the members as a lump sum benefit and withdraw money out of superannuation? Then the short answer to that is also yes, right? But it can't have been the primary purpose 20 years ago was to get all these tax concessions associated with the property, leave it in the super environment, and then later on pay it out as a benefit. You've got to clearly have the intention of that capital and that growth and that income point to provide for retirement. So, just be mindful as to why people are entering into it. But we've got to ask that question of every transaction anyhow. The sole purpose test still drives everything that we actually do. So, we come back to that from a residential property point of view as a concept, and then we move into this new legislative piece that says, okay, now if we want to acquire real property via a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, then from the 10th of August 2026, it must satisfy the definition of business real property. The definition of business real property is in itself also quite a complex one, right? Now, it's an area that received a lot of focus 20 plus years ago from the regulator with regards to, and when probably 26, 27 years ago, sort of in the late 90s, where there was a restriction on how much business property that could be acquired by a small superannuation fund back in the day. And that changed in 98, 99, where they brought in this capacity to acquire up to 100% of the fund investments in business real property. So they opened it up as an opportunity for people to put business premises into their super fund and then somewhat expand upon that by allowing assets to be leased to related parties. So all these special exceptions that sit around business real property, subject to that property meeting the definition of business real property. 2009, we saw the ATO release a ruling as to what is business real property. That's an interesting one, and you might have seen some commentary around that in the past sort of few weeks, over the last couple of months, around how that ruling hasn't necessarily kept up with time with regards to business real property. So it gives us a very good outline as to what the Commissioner thinks business real property is, but it doesn't necessarily capture all the elements of what business real property is in today's environment as we've moved to different things like Airbnb. There's various other sorts of online businesses that the business is actually property and property leasing and other things. And so there's a whole lot of areas that I think are still problematic because of the BRP ruling and the ATO's definition of business real property that come into question with relation to these LRBA rules. And I'll touch on some of them as we continue through the presentation. But what we need to understand from an absolute clarity point of view is we're talking about freehold or leasehold interest in real property. Right? There are certain elements of Crown land that can be incorporated into that business real property definition, but for the most part, for the vast majority of self-managed super funds, it's that leasehold or freehold interest, where the property is used wholly and exclusively in one or more business. So I'm going to touch on wholly and exclusively as part of the presentation, but it is a key area that we need to understand, that this concept of wholly and exclusively is now, it was very relevant for acquisition of an asset from a related party rule, right? Which of course is where the link is here. It's very relevant for the exception to the in-house asset rules, is that we satisfy the wholly and exclusively requirement. And now it's very relevant with regards to 67A and that single acquirable asset, that there is no other use for that property. And when you go through SMSF rule in 2009-1 and talk about the definition of business real property, you know, they do focus quite significantly on the idea of wholly and exclusively, two terms which, whilst they sort of sound the same, they have different meanings with regards to the use of property. And then we have some minor exceptions, and the major minor exception, that's badly phrased, but the major exception is primary production land, where there is going to be some personal use versus business use. But ultimately, when we're talking about wholly and exclusively, what we're really trying to identify is that, to the extent that the land or the property is being used, it is being used for business purposes, right? So they're not saying that that every part of the land is actually being used, right? But all that is being used for business purposes. So that's the use, the exclusivity element. So it's saying that if you've got, for example, a warehouse, if you've got a factory, if you've got, you know, even an accounting practice, a financial services practice, whatever it might be, a legal practice inside a property, that you don't have a portion of that property being used for personal purposes. And often the example they use is storing personal things on site, or there might be some other non-business activity used, particularly on primary production. There might be some paddocks that people are using for, you know, hobby farming, or just riding their own horses and other things, and that starts to restrict property from meeting that definition of business real property. So that's the exclusively piece. The wholly is to the extent that you can use the property, it's wholly being used for business. So it's not saying that the whole property must be used, but that is able to be used is being used for business purposes. So you've got to understand and work through that. So that's a full presentation in itself as to the definition of business real property. But it means that there are certain elements around, you know, certain retail shops and things where there might be some residency upstairs, or some other purpose to it. You know, that's going to fail the exclusion, and I'll touch on some of the areas that I think are still grey as I go through the rest of the presentation as well. But there is the one exception when it comes to land and property, and that is our primary production exception. And that says that where we've got primary production land and no more than 2 hectares is used for effectively the primary residence. So there will be a residential use element to that land, but that area is less than 2 hectares, then it does not change the nature of that property from being business real property. And so therefore, you know, generally, if you've got somebody on site managing the farm or whatever it might be, and they live in a residence, and that residence area is defined as less than 2 hectares, then it still satisfies the definition of business real property. But what we've got to be very careful here, and this I think is going to be the area from an LRBA point of view that people will potentially be caught out. I mean, from a primary production point of view, there's a couple of areas. One is that the single acquirable asset definition ultimately talks about land that is bought and sold as a single asset, right? And so if you've got multiple titles, then there is a risk that from a vendor point of view, you can actually separate those titles and sell them as separate parcels, right? And so the residential property might be actually on a separate title to some of the farming land. And And if the only thing that is stopping the splitting of that asset is the vendor not wanting to split it, then that doesn't satisfy the definition of single acquirable asset. But if there's other impediments to the sale, like it effectively must be sold, or there are encumbrances, so again, there might be buildings that are sitting over multiple titles, and they're not demountable, so you can't just pull it down. So if you've got things that almost force these multiple titles to be considered as one from a sale point of view, then it is a single acquirable asset. But if there's nothing in a primary production environment that requires all of those parcels to be considered one parcel, then it wouldn't be a single acquirable asset. So the business real property one's always been a bit of a questionable one when it comes to LRBAs, versus a direct investment from a super fund where the number of titles is not too significant. So how much that impacts funds moving forward from an LRBA point of view, I can't say that, but it's certainly an area to be mindful of. So the primary production exception continues to exist under 67A because it exists under section 66. So therefore, we can acquire primary production where there is less than 2 hectares used for residential purposes. We can still acquire that under an LRBA, subject to it meeting all of the other conditions. So that's one where we do have capacity. Where we've then got some areas, and I'll touch on some other grey areas a bit shortly, is things like the use of residential property, right? So if you look at SMSFR 2009-1, definition of business real property, the question asks, is an investment property considered to be business real property? And the standard answer is no, it's not, right? But if you have a significant portfolio, and I can't remember the exact number, but I think in that ruling they reference somebody with 20 investment properties, then they are in the business of leasing properties, right? And multiple properties. And so in that instance, if you had a property and you transferred that into the self-managed super fund under the ruling, that would be considered business real property. But you have to start from a space that says all residential properties, so any property that's subject to be leased as residential property, is going to fail business real property definition. And if you think for whatever reasons that it might pass, then you've got to get that confirmed by the ATO. So for me, that's one where clients need to go out and get legal opinion, but ultimately SMSF advice, and going to the ATO and asking to have that definition satisfied is going to be incumbent on the trustees, versus trying to enter into an arraignment saying, well, we felt that this property met the definition in accordance with the ATO ruling, and so we acquired it via an LRBA. But yeah, it's a residential property because we're leasing it out to people to live in, right? And then say, well, we relied on the ruling. To me, that's not going to cut it. Since the 10th of August, people generally are going to have to get confirmation from the ATO that something would meet that definition before. Same with land development cases. And land development cases, you would say are definitely a no-no, even though they might satisfy the definition of business real property, right? Land development cases are problematic because you're buying vacant land, but under LRBA, you're going to end up with a property on there, and so therefore you've changed the nature. Quite different from a home and land package where you're buying it off the plan package and you know what you're getting at the end of it. If you've got land for development, that's not the case there. So there's some quirky parts of the business real property definition that I would think would fail under the LRBA because of the improvement and changing the nature of the transaction. So being mindful there. And vacant land, whilst vacant land can be used for business purposes, you can't change the nature of it. And so buying land that is used as part of the business premises, might be for car parking, might be for other purposes. If you then go and change it and put something else on there, whilst that LRBA is in place, then you're going to have a problem. And of course, that's always been the case with vacant land and LRBAs, is that the acquisition of vacant land means that the asset subject to the LRBA must remain as vacant land right through until the end of time. So, those sort of quirky existing assets inside the definition that sit inside the definition of business real property may be problematic as we move into the LRBA arrangement. So The law came in 26th of July. So I wanted to put that business real property piece in there before we start to talk through the mechanics of how the legislative changes work and what it means for funds that have entered into transactions in the build up to the 10th of August. So we got our royal assent. The commencement date was the 10th of August, and so therefore from the 10th of August, we must satisfy that definition of business real property. A lot of it was reliant on, okay, well, there's limited material as to what this all means. We know that the SMSF Association, they were pretty much on the front foot with Treasury and with the regulator from day one of the announcement to make sure that there was a rapid response to this. You'll note if you go onto the ATO website, about 4 or 5 of the existing ATO pages that deal with LRBAs have been updated between mid-July and the 3rd of August. But specifically, they released this page, changes to limited recourse borrowing arrangements, which went live on the 28th of July. And it covers off on a lot of the key issues that I'm talking about with you today with regards to the way the exception works specifically, and the exception which says, that from the 10th of August, you can only acquire an asset if it's real property, or it meets the definition of business real property, and any arrangement before the 10th of August for it to be considered in place prior to that point in time, the criteria that you actually need to satisfy. And that criteria is ultimately all about the contract. And so if trustees of a self-managed superannuation fund entered into a contract to purchase property that was residential property prior to the 10th of August, right, then settlement and even the LRBA arrangement itself were not a requirement by the 10th of August. Okay, and so, and again, depending on jurisdiction where people are, there's some quirks, and I'm going to run through a couple of those in a moment as well. But in reality, what it meant was the trustees really needed to know who their holding trust would be. So ultimately saying, well, we haven't got so far as to set up all the bare trust and all those other documents yet. And in some states that is critical, but we know how the asset is going to be held. We know that we can't put the asset in the name of the SMSF trustees, because that's been a no-no since day one, right? So we had to have a separate entity. So as long as the contract is signed before the 10th of August, right, identifying who the purchaser is, right, and ideally that purchaser is the holding trustee, then any residential property arrangement entered into before the 10th of August is fine, regardless of when the loan commences, right, and regardless of where the settlement where the settlement has occurred. So particularly in the example that the ATO provide on the page that I referenced before is talking about that off the plan where effectively someone entered into the arrangement, let's say in July, but the property won't settle until July next year, right, because of the build process. As long as that contract was signed before the 10th of August, then that's fine for satisfying the residential property exception. So that's going to be the key to everything, is going to be the contract. Now, what I'm about to say is ultimately coming from, let's call it 19 years of administrative practice and compliance support with regards to limited recourse borrowing arrangements. The questions that a lot of people always ask is, things like, if we haven't got a self-managed superannuation fund, this is always a historical question. If we haven't got a self-managed superannuation fund and we identify a property, could we, and we put and/or nominees on the terms of the initial contract, can we then identify that can we nominate the holding trust to acquire the property sort of at that point in settlement? My immediate answer to a question like that, particularly if you haven't got a self-managed superannuation fund, is that whilst that might have, in instances that I saw over that period of time, funds have got away with that, I kind of feel that because this arrangement is specific to a very, very specific, very finite date, being the 10th of August. If the self-managed super fund isn't established by the 10th of August, I would say that that trying to use the and/or nominees approach to a contract doesn't cut it, right? So because the fund itself couldn't enter into that contract. So two things that are critical: one, you've got a self-managed super fund before the 10th of August, so the fund has been set up, and two, you've then got that contract in place by that point in time. The idea that you might change the name, so you may not have had the holding trust set up, right? So you'd put it in a name other than the name of the trustees and use that and/or nominee. There is reference within the ATO material that really talks about that you can make minor changes to the contract, but not significant changes or variations to the contract. Is an and/or nominee, and then nominating the holding trustee, is that minor or is that significant? I would probably put that at the minor end, but again, I would hope that anyone that has entered into these transactions before the 10th of August has done so with the clear outline of knowing who their holding trustee was, or what the name of that company or who the individuals would be, that it is a separate entity to the trustees of the self-managed super fund, to ensure that the asset's never in the name of the trustees of the super fund, because that's a blanket fail straight away. It always has been. And that people, get that position clear, that they, even if they haven't got the loan in place, even if the bare trust arrangement's not in place, that at least they had a contract and the holding trustee name to be able to incorporate into that contract at the start. So they're probably the key things there. What I highlighted, and some of the stuff that we do at Smarter SMSF with LRBAs, is we provide a bit of sort of guidance. We work closely with our lawyers there in reference to property transactions and property transfers and things. Some key things to be mindful of is that in every state except for Queensland and then the Northern Territory, in every state you can actually establish the holding trust, so the bare trust arrangement after the entry into the contract, right? So you can sign a contract and then set up the bare trust. You can't do that in Queensland, right? In Queensland, you have to have the bare trust arrangement in place, and the same with the Northern Territory. So it's important to understand that the jurisdiction you're in is going to dictate your holding trust requirements there. A couple of other things that are important to know from a contract point of view is how the titling should be done, right? And this, as I said, this excludes intermediary LRBAs, which is all done in the name of the holding trust anyhow. But from a standard LRBA arrangement, you've then got your naming conventions that you need to stick to. And again, there's a little bit of nuance, a bit of difference between each of the states. Some don't recognise trusts or whatever, so some you're just putting the holding trust company name. Obviously, all my examples here are referencing corporate trustees. Nothing that says you can't have an LRBA with individual holding trustees, as long as a self-managed super fund doesn't have individual trustees, right? So that's something obviously to be mindful of. But all of these examples do incorporate the corporate holding trustee, and then you got your various stamping requirements. So whether or not there is any duty payable for the establishment of the holding trustee, and your stamping requirements as well. So not spending any time specifically on those elements here with you today, but just wanted to incorporate it into the presentation so you have a reference point, but always checking with your local conveyancing requirements, and that when you're entering into the transaction is clearly important. So we need to understand, and I've already touched on and spoken through a number of the key issues around the grandfathering requirements and the guardrails that are put in place, sort of as the general conversation as part of the session. But things that we need to be 100% clear on, right, is that anything before the 10th of August, right, is subject to the pre-10 August rules, right? So all those rules that I put on the first slide about single acquirable asset, the transfer to the trustee, all those elements there still apply, and there's no restriction, no consideration as to what the definition is from a real property point of view. So any existing residential property investments through an LRBA totally fine, right? They can be refinanced as well. Okay, so refinancing, I raised the issue before around the safe harbour, right? Well, firstly, the ability to refinance safe harbour is fairly limiting in the sense from safe harbour to safe harbour, because safe harbour is safe harbour. So, you're not actually changing the nature of anything there. You've got your 15-year restriction. But if you're looking to move from safe harbour to related party to a commercial lender, to commercial, that issue with regards to that. So you might have a problem with commercial lender having willingness to take on a related party loan, but the concept itself is not going to be a compliance issue from a grandfathering point of view. As I said, the settlement piece is important. The settlement piece and the actual the financing piece are pretty important. That they are effectively part of the guardrailing element, but also the grandfathering it's all about that contract. So get that contract, or for those where those contracts were signed, it was quite remarkable. We do a lot of fund documentation as well. So part of our business, we do education, we do document provision. We set up like a staggering number of holding trustees or holding trusts in that period, sort of basically July through to early August. So there's clearly a lot of transactions, and this is the piece that if I sort of segue to the ongoing discussion piece around super funds and the inability to use self-managed super funds for new builds. That push is not so much, whilst it is being supported and coming from the SMSF Association and other parts of the super industry, a lot of that's actually been driven by the housing industry, who point to the fact that a lot of residential new builds have been done via self-managed super funds and LRBAs. And so if the purpose of this measure was around CGT and negative gearing, right? Well, firstly, self-managed super funds are the last entity of any entity really to do negative gearing, because from an LRBA point of view, and I appreciate that some of them would do it, but from an LRBA point of view, most lenders require the ability to see that the fund has the liquidity and the repayment capacity so that it's not diving into its other assets. And clearly that's a key part of LRBAs, is that the fund has the capacity to fund or to positively gear to be able to acquire these assets. So, new purchases and LRBAs really weren't a negative gearing issue or consideration. And so, to restrict self-managed super funds from now undertaking something that the rest of the market can still do and still avail itself to from a negative gearing point of view seems to be from an industry point of view, seems to be the wrong approach. And that's, I think, where those outside the industry and a lot of the housing elements are working with the SMSF Association to go back to government and say, well, should you be looking at having this carve out, this business real property carve out, change to reflect what you're providing for and what you're allowing for in the rest of the market, which is that new builds, because the idea is we want more property available for people, that new builds still are available through limited recourse borrowing arrangements. Let me be clear, they're not at the moment, but that is hopefully something that we see debated on and discussed further in the future. And of course, I've seen some comments that this could be one of the election issues moving forward, is whether or not residential property can be brought back into the fold under certain specific sort of restrictions as to what it would entail. That, of course, is problematic from an industry point of view in monitoring and understanding what all that means. But at least we hope and see that discussion continues on. So we can still refinance. Nothing changes with any asset held before the 10th of August. Where we do materially change things, right, when we're talking about the maintenance and repairs of assets, and therefore change the nature, that's going to be potentially a problem from a financing point of view. So we have to be careful there. And look, again, I've always been strong on that you can use borrowed monies for repairs and maintenance. I've always been an advocate more of saying, well, if you're needing to borrow to and incorporating repairs and maintenance costs in that original loan, so you can't do it for new repairs and maintenance because that becomes a new loan and that becomes problematic, and that's not refinancing, that's a new LRBA, and that would be problematic. And so any existing LRBA over residential property that incorporated repairs and maintenance into its original loan or drawback facilities, that's fine. But if you then go to look at, right, we need money for repairs and maintenance, that would be a new loan, and that would cause the situation to blow up. So we need to be mindful as to what that actually means as well from these funds' point of view. So number of sort of key elements to be mindful of there. The grey areas, and these are not necessarily that they're grey, it's areas that I think that we need to, because they're definitely not black and white, so I guess they're grey, right? But the key thing here is where you've got your mixed use property, that won't satisfy the definition of business real property, but then it comes down to that wholly and exclusively. So if you've got a shop front and it's got some residency upstairs, but it's not actually being leased for residential purposes, there's things to consider there. One thing is, well, can all that upstairs element be used for business purposes, right? And then is it, right? So can is one question, is the critical question, because if it's not being used for business purposes, then we're not satisfying the exclusively requirement, right? Definitely don't meet the wholly because there's a residency piece there, but you're going to fail under some of those key criteria. But if before the fund acquires the property, the upstairs residential part is converted into business storage or more offices or something like that, and it then continues to meet the definition of business real property, then that would be fine. So from a related party point of view, you'd be able to acquire that asset. But if it is a shop front with an upstairs residency and it maintains that upstairs residency as a residency, then you're going to have an ongoing problem as far as that fund is concerned. So, key things that people be mindful with, to not try and be too cute with what they're trying to achieve from a limited recourse borrowing arrangement. I've talked about the primary production piece. Clearly that 2 hectares is key. It's a pretty significant residency piece with regards to it, but it's important to recognise that the primary use of the land still has to be that primary production business. So any sort of hobby farming land is not going to satisfy business real property. And then the other piece is, if, and this is what the ATO have put into their guidance, is that there is nothing wrong with the trustees looking to release property, right? So if you effectively have the end of a lease term and you then have vacancy whilst you are seeking out new tenants, right, that asset will not fail business real property definition. But if you have end of a lease and then you choose not to lease the asset out, so it would normally be a business premises, but you take the decision to keep it vacant for a period of time, so there's no activity to try and generate that income from it, then that's going to fail, right? It's not going to meet that business real property definition. The ATO have highlighted that within their pages, so that's going to become a key question from a fund audit point of view, right? Is that auditors are going to be asking the question, not only is it business real property, so is it property that is used wholly exclusively, is it actively being used for business purposes? So auditors, I think, will take a different direction with some of these transactions, which again is there's nothing wrong with holding vacant property in a self-managed super fund from a capital appreciation purposes and other things, but for Section 67A, the tax office are ultimately saying that this asset needs to be continually generating income or seeking out a tenant to be able to do that, rather than be at the whim of the trustees to hold it for a period of time where they're not using to or choosing to lease it out. So there's a couple of key areas that that I think will become hot audit topics in this new post 10 August LRBA position. So some things for people to be mindful of in this space. It's going to be from a transactional point of view, it's going to be an interesting year. The 26-27 year is going to be interesting because clearly there's going to be for 1.5 months or just under 1.5 months, a lot of transactions where people have set up LRBAs or people have at least entered into contracts. And then there's going to be sort of this spread over a period of time. And that could be, 12 months, could be 18 months. Who knows from a settlement point of view if it's an off the plan piece, where there's no borrowing arrangement in place necessarily, or only the start of a borrowing arrangement in place, that fund auditors are going to be monitoring these issues. So there's the definitional stuff that we need to be aware of, and then there's the practical implications that we need to make sure we are satisfying and continually monitoring what the regulator is saying in this area to ensure that we're not in breach of any of the rules as such. So, a couple of things to be mindful of here, and that is residential property in a self-managed super fund is not banned. Right? Acquiring residential property in a super fund via a limited recourse borrowing arrangement from the 10th of August is what has effectively been banned or been changed from a legislative point of view. So self-managed super funds can still acquire residential property. How can they do that? They can still do it directly, right? So self-managed super fund can still, not from a related party, but a self-managed super fund can still acquire residential property, and as long as it's not leased to a related party, so not acquired from nor leased to a related party, then residential property is still a viable acquisition from a self-managed superannuation fund. Tenants in common, right? So self-managed super fund can still acquire property as tenants in common with a related party, with another party. More likely it's going to be with a related party, and that doesn't breach. You've got your in-house asset restriction, which says that asset can't be leased to a related party. You've got section 66 that says that asset can't be acquired from a related party, right? But we can still enter into tenants in common arrangements over residential property. Self-managed super fund can still invest in an ungeared trust or company. I've got trust as the core entity here. Can still acquire shares or units in a trust, and that trust can acquire residential property. Right? So there's no no problems with us still engaging under the 1322C requirements to acquire property. And this could be like the 1322C for me is the obvious replacement from an LRBA arrangement point of view, where if the super fund doesn't have the full funding to acquire the residential property, then the super fund and another party, instead of going tenants in common, because tenants in common creates that acquisition restriction that you can't do, right? But if you acquire units in a unit trust, and that unit trust acquires the residential property, then section 66 allows for the acquisition of those units from the related party, right? So as long as the property itself wasn't acquired from a related party, which can't be, right? So as long as the property is not acquired from a related party and not leased to a related party, then the super fund can over time acquire those units from the related party under the 1322C exception. So there is still scope and means to be able to acquire residential property in the fund in a manner that is not direct, and that's via the use of these ungeared 1322C vehicles. Of course, the other one is legislatively, there's never been a restriction on the ability to acquire units or borrow to acquire units in a unit trust, and for that unit trust to then go off and buy residential property. So still using that 1322C, but actually doing it via an LRBA arrangement. Legislatively, that's fine, right? Commercially, that's almost impossible, because no commercial lender will lend for you to buy units in a related trust. And if a commercial lender is not going to do it, and I say no commercial lender, I haven't contacted them all, but the reality is, in practice, the lenders won't lend for that. So if they won't lend for it, then you can't do it as a related party loan, because related party loan either has to satisfy safe harbor. Safe harbor doesn't provide for units in an unrelated unit trust, only for listed stuff and for real property. So it doesn't provide for safe harbor, and for it to not be gnarly, if you want to have terms that aren't in accordance with safe harbour, then they have to meet the terms that would have been provided to you by a commercial lender. Well, it's a circular argument, because if there's no commercial lender, then you can't create terms for those circumstances. So there are still opportunities that exist out there for people to acquire residential property. As I said, I guess there's industry hope as well that we get to a position where we have new builds brought back into the equation, but right as it stands at this point in time, that's not the situation. But we still do have this capacity at now under the direct or 1322C to be able to acquire it. So as we sort of wrap up to today's session, the ban's in effect, right? So I shouldn't have put the word ban. The change is in effect. There was some fear when the announcement was first made that self-managed super funds were having LRBAs being taken away from them. But of course, as the time progressed, and that time was fairly short, it came back to being residential property. Took effect on the 10th of August, which was that 45 days. And the royal assent came because the Greens agreed or the Labor agreed to the changes that the Greens proposed around the banning of residential property via the insertion of business real property. So BRP is now the only gateway for real property via limited recourse borrowing arrangements. The grandfathering rules and understanding the grandfathering rules are critical to how this process works. So knowing anything before the 10th of August is fine, even if the entirety of the arrangement isn't locked down, as long as the contract's in place, and pre-10 August is no problems. But don't change the nature of that asset after the 10th of August. Don't do anything under an LRBA to create an issue, because then you will be in breach of Section 67, which of course has other penalties and things associated with admin penalties and other compliance concerns as well. So pretty important that we get things right in that regard. And then there's still some issues around mixed use assets, but also certain assets that otherwise meet the definition of business real property, I think will fail the definition under an LRBA just because of the changing nature. So vacant land, land development places, land development land, those sorts of elements there are going to be problematic under the changes that have been introduced via limited recourse borrowing arrangements. So that's it. What I wanted to sort of highlight for you as well today. So we've got our our next webinar in September will be on some pension considerations, and then I've got to finalise the topics for the final quarter for the year, October, November, December. Smarter SMSF, we are doing an LRBA masterclass because it's a bit of an opportunity to not only go through this rule, but all the other rules. We're doing something on the 2nd of September. So I've provided a link for you there if you wanted to, or if you were interested in attending that. As always, SuperGuardian will send out a copy of the presentation with the CPD for today, and then they will subsequently, once I send them through everything, they'll then put the recording up on their website, onto their education page. So that will all occur afterwards. So thank you for attending. I hope you got a little bit out of that. Let me see whether I've got any more questions there.